Good evening. On behalf of the World Bank Group in Jordan and the Abdulhamid Showman Foundation, I would like to start by welcoming our esteemed panelists and guests and the audiences who are following this discussion panel, where we launched the Jordan Economic Monitor Report for the spring of 2021. This report was prepared by the World Bank Group MENA region. The report covers the past 6 months and follows from the previous report, which was published in the fall of 2020 and which was launched under the title of Navigated Through the Continued Turbulence. While at the time, the turbulence seemed to continue endlessly and without any certainty, the report today, and by contrast, is being launched under a different title, which is Uncertain and Long Road Ahead. This title in itself provides a very telling summary of the challenges facing Jordan, as we will hear shortly. This valuable report provides a comprehensive view to the government, academia, think tanks and researchers, and the public about the recent economic developments in Jordan. It's a very valuable compendium that is divided into 2 sections. The first part of this report covers economic developments in Jordan, with emphasis on the economic growth, labor and unemployment, fiscal and debt developments, monetary policies, and the future outlook. In addition, the second part of this report addresses how more closely COVID-19 has impacted the economy in Jordan, with specific emphasis on the inequalities that have arisen as a result thereof. With the release of this report today, we are reminded of the impact of COVID-19, which cannot in any way be understated. It has affected the whole world. Nonetheless, objective analysis of the economy and the prospects moving ahead requires that we not round up all our economic woes to COVID-19. The pandemic, while has been very impactful, has also provided continuity to a situation that was prevalent before it. A neutral assessment needs to look at the various fiscal and monetary and government policies before and during COVID-19. In this regard, the importance of this report, as with any other industry specialist reports, cannot be understated. It provides timely data and information to researchers and to decision makers that examines both past performance and provides input for policy making for the future. There are also much needed input for researchers as they are published by credible sources like the World Bank itself. In our session this afternoon and extending to the evening, we will start by a presentation of the report by Dr. Sadia Rifkat, a senior country economist with the World Bank Group. We will then follow her presentation with a panel discussion with our esteemed guests, whom I'm very happy to welcome with us this evening. They are Dr. Nidal Azzam, Executive Director of the Research Department with the Central Bank of Jordan, Dr. Adli Qandah, a seasoned and experienced economist and banking expert, and last but not least, Dr. Safiris Sanatos, Senior Consultant in the field of development strategy and social policy. And I see a grin, Dr. Safiris. I hope I didn't pronounce it wrongly, your name. We will then open the floor for a discussion and questions from the audiences. So, dear audiences, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Sadia Rifkat to give us a brief and highlights from the Jordan Economic Report for the spring of 2021. Dr. Sadia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Engineer Rami. Let me just put the presentation, share my screen first, please. So I just wanted to confirm first that you can see my screen, right?
We can, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So welcome to the launch of Jordan Economic Monitor, titled Uncertain and Long Trail Ahead. My name is Sadia Rifkat. As Engineer Rami introduced me, I'm Senior Economist for the World Bank in Jordan. This presentation is going to be in 4 parts. The first part is going to cover the main thrust of the report, which is looking at the developments during 2020. In the second part of the report, we will cover the special sections of the report briefly. And there are 2 special sections which look at the impact of COVID-19 shock on the private sector and the household. The third section of the presentation will focus on the outlook, and the fourth one will focus on, so where do we go from here? I have around 20 slides, and I think I will take around 20 to 22 minutes to cover the entire presentation, so please bear with me. I will try to be on time. One of the first most important takeaway that I do want you to take from this presentation is that even though global economy is showing sign of recovery, but the recovery remains uneven at best. And this we can clearly see from the left-hand side of the figure, where we see global economic prospects of the World Bank projection for the world and the region for June 2021 vis-a-vis January 2021. Even though the global projection has been increased by 1.5 percentage points to 5.6%, most of this growth actually is coming from the change in the prospect of growth for the advanced economies, which are expected to now grow by 2.2% higher than January 2021 projection. If we look across the regions, what we are seeing is that there is very little change. For example, if we look at MENA and if we look at the emerging market, there is very little room for celebration because not much has changed significantly compared to previous projection. On the right-hand side, I have in front of you a COVID-19 graph for the world 7 days moving average cases in the black line, and also emerging market and advanced economies. The takeaway that I do want you to take from this one is that we saw first peak of the cases for the world around December 2020, and then we saw another peak which was taller than the previous one in April 2021. Where the cases almost touched 1 billion. And now, even though cases have come down 1/3, but it's still far from over because the level remains still quite high. One clear takeaway was that the December peak was driven by advanced economies cases, while the April 2021 peak has been driven by cases in the emerging market as well as the developing countries. So how did the Jordan economy do in 2020? What I have in front of me, and you can also see, is basically the global economic growth for over 126 countries. Of course, in this slide, you can just see 46, but we used all 126 countries from June 2021. And you can see that Jordan, despite being a small and open economy, and heavily reliant on tourism, contracted by only 1.6% in 2020. In fact, if we arrange this in the ascending order, Jordan actually falls in top 42 countries which either experience no growth contraction in 2020 or experience very little contraction. The report explores that why did this happen? Because as I mentioned, that the tourism impact of reduction was quite significant in terms of exports of goods and services. And that's a very significant shock that happened. But on the other side, Jordan benefited from significant decline being an oil importer countries from the price of international oil reduction, which between 2019 and 2020 almost reduced by 34%. If you take the US dollar Brent price per barrel as a proxy, for example, as a result, the value of the petroleum product import for Jordan between these 2 years declined by almost 50%. So there was a positive terms of trade shock created by significant movement in the price of oil on the other direction, while the tourism was creating a negative shock. Also, you see, because of the international price decline and also the decline in aggregate demand, there was a very little subdued impact on the prices in the domestic economy. In fact, the CPI headline inflation averaged around 0.3%, and we have just plotted few countries in the region vis-a-vis Jordan, and you can see that there's hardly any movement in the CPI. While if you look at the tourism receipts, the travel receipts during 2020, you can see large spike downward. Basically, Jordan during 2020, the tourism inflow in receipts reduced by almost 76%. So it was quite significant. What also helped is that Jordan allowed the external account, particularly the current account deficit, to expand significantly between 2019 and 2020. Current account deficit expanded, as you can see on the right-hand side of the figure, from 2.1% of GDP in 2019 to almost 8% of GDP in 2020. And also, please keep in mind that this adjustment remained orderly. If you look at the external financing flows on the right-hand side, Jordan, in fact, benefited with higher external financing flows during 2020 compared to 2019. This, of course, also includes Jordan's own market access of Euro bonds of 1.75 billion. So when the shock was happening, interestingly, the central bank gross reserves also increased by 1.5 billion US dollar. So that's also quite significant. The third most important factor that helped the economy to mitigate part of the shock was that the monetary and fiscal policy remained well coordinated. In fact, together, the stimuli that was provided during 2020 was more than 10% of GDP, of which almost 8% of GDP was the monetary stimuli, which was presented very early on during the fiscal year when the shock started. Along with this, the government remained proactive in terms of providing cash support to vulnerable and poor households and helping the businesses as well as tourism sector as well. So if you look at the figure that I have on the left-hand side, which is plotting different countries' mitigation of a crisis through monetary policy, which is on the horizontal axis, and fiscal policies, which is on the vertical axis, you can see different countries used different combination depending on which space they had more, either on the monetary side or the fiscal side. And Jordan, like other countries, also used a combination which was more perfect for Jordan in terms of the space that it had. So the report has a very interesting box, and I also encourage you to take a look at that, which looks at the cyclicity of the fiscal policy for Jordan over the past 40 years. And typically, as is the evidence from the emerging market as well as from the developing countries, and also if you have seen the seminal paper from Reinhardt, Kaminsky, and Wag 2004, that evidence from almost 83 developing countries is that the fiscal policy in these countries remain pro-cyclical. What this means is that when there's economic growth happening in the economy, the fiscal policy expands, and when the economic growth is contracting, the fiscal policy also contracted. So in other way, it amplifies the business cycle rather than acting as an automatic stabilizer. What was different for 2020 was that actually the Jordan fiscal policy remained counter-cyclical. When the economy was in recession, the primary balance almost increased by 2.5% of GDP, and 70% of this increase came from discretionary fiscal policy. And if you look at the right side figure, as has been the experience of most of the world with this crisis, that because of need to provide fiscal stimuli, the debt level have also increased. So Jordan also experienced the same increase. There's around 7% of GDP increase in general government debt between 2019 and 2020. But what you can see from the figure in front of you, the debt level increase is quite similar to average in MENA. Of course, inside MENA, there's ample heterogeneity for us to enforce the average. But if we look at how much the world experienced on average increase in debt to GDP, this increase was around 13.5%. So Jordan still had a quite contained increase in debt to GDP ratio despite a crisis. Well, this is one part, but what we are also seeing in the other economic indicator in 2020 is that we are seeing serious deterioration. And one particular area where we are seeing this is in the labor market indicators, where we are seeing the unemployment rate reach as high as 22.7% at end of the fiscal year. If you look at the unemployment for youth, male and female, this is significantly higher than this number. So there is a crisis that we are seeing in the labor market indicator. Moreover, I talked about the unprecedented decline in travel receipts, around 76%. Jordan also experienced a 9% decline in remittances largely because of the oil shock that also impacted remittances, where almost 3/4 of the remittances are coming from the GCC countries. And like many other countries, it also experienced a twin deficit, and which led to the rise in the debt levels. Now, the economy the experience of economy was also reflected in the private sector. And this is also one of the special sections that looks at the private sector, how it did compare during the shock. So there was a survey done by the World Bank group of around 600 firms, one in August 2020, and then followed that up with the second survey in February 2021. One of the findings is that even before entering into this crisis, the private sector firms were entering with limited buffer. And this was the takeaway from the World Bank Group Enterprise Survey of 2019. For example, they were reporting, even prior to the crisis, negative sales around 6%, negative employment around 1%, and significant negative labor productivity. So when the COVID-19 shock happened, these firms had more limited buffer, and there was a compounding of crisis and impact on these firms. In fact, these firms were already utilizing only for 58% of capacity prior to the shock, compared to a 68% for MENA region. And this declined to a 50% even 9 months into the crisis. A lot of firms also experienced permanent closure, which averaged within this sample around 11%, with higher incidence around 14% for firms in the services sector, particularly the firms in the construction and tourism. Almost 97%, so all of the firms reported having an issue with liquidity and shortage, and using different strategies to cope with it through credit, equity, or delayed payments to the tax authorities or to the landlords. But what was also part and mentioned in the survey, particularly with the first survey during the COVID-19 crisis, that almost 40% of the firms benefited from government policy interventions in one way or the other. Almost within this 40%, almost 67% benefited from the wage subsidies, while around 20% also benefited from new lines of credit. Moving forward, it's very clear that this shock is not over yet. And of course, it's not, the policy does not just only need to focus on the fact that these firms survived the crisis, but it's also important to pay attention to the fact that resilience within these smaller firms is also built. And here the government policy is super important for capability improvement, helping with export promotion, use of digital technology. All of these are factors which are of paramount importance at this time. As I mentioned, the second special section of this report looks at the COVID-19 shock impact on the household. The focus is much more global, and of course, Jordan is also covered as a part of this. And it's very clear from this survey is that the COVID-19 shock has amplified pre-existing inequalities between rich and poor household within a country and across countries. It has also impacted, there's no doubt about this, disproportionately the poor and vulnerable households. And because of the earlier fundamental condition that these households and their members existed in. One thing that we are seeing is that by end of 2021, almost 100 million additional households will enter extreme poverty across the globe. So that is significant, very significant number. And of course, as I said, Jordan also experienced this shock for the household within Jordan. But it's also very clear that government's timely and targeted support of cash transfer did help mitigate some of this crisis. But I think it's also important to remember that the impact is quite long-term on the household vulnerability, whether it's coming from poverty, employment, nutrition, and learning, whether it's education sites. So in the medium term, in the long term, there's a need to ensure that all relevant policy, whether they deal with social protection, health, education, or growth, they are as inclusive as possible in order to minimize the scarring that is left on the poor and vulnerable household, which are more disproportionate. Now looking ahead, so what are we seeing and where do we go from here? The left figure basically is giving you the full vaccination and single dose vaccination across a lot of countries, and Jordan is in the darker bar in I think in the first quintile or so. As you can see, as of end of June, the full vaccination for Jordan is around 11% of population. Of course, the single dose vaccination is higher. And this you can see that different countries have had different level of vaccination. Now, why is this important is that if you look at the stringency index of Oxford on the right-hand side, with 0 representing full open and 100 representing a full closure, Jordan is represented by a red line that you can see. So if we just take a period when Jordan started to lock down for the first time between March 2020 and June 2021, we have around 15 months period. And during this 15 months period, half of the time, Jordan's stringency index remained higher than 70%. So that means that social distancing remained a very viable policy tool in order to minimize the health impact and has an impact on the economy. And that is extremely important to remember. And this we can also see from this graph that is representing COVID-19 cases in the region, along with Jordan, which is represented by a red line, that Jordan experienced so far 2 large waves, one around November 2020, and the other one just a few months ago around March 21. What we saw from these waves is that they are coming after a short period of respite, and the latter wave that we saw was more intense. The peak was higher, the duration was lower, but it was more intense. And you can also see an upward trend in a lot of countries in the region as well. And this is also a similar experience that when we see globally, other than the advanced economy, and we look at rising cases in Russia, we see rising cases in most of Latin America driven by Brazil. We are seeing rising cases, although the peak has come down somewhat because of declining cases in India, but we are also seeing cases increase in countries like UK, which have a very high level of vaccination. And almost in UK and India, 90% of the rise in new cases is because of the new mutation, which is the Delta variant. So this is, as long as the vaccine as a percentage of population remains modest, the takeaway from this slide and the previous slide is that the countries are vulnerable to the waves of COVID-19 shock that a lot of countries are experiencing after one and the other waves. So based on this, the vaccination of the population remains the most important factor for the immediate forecast of the economy. Based on this, our forecast for 2021 for Jordan is that the economy is going to grow by 1.4 percentage points and then recover in the medium term to slightly above 2%. We are basically looking at fiscal consolidation during 2021, but a modest fiscal consolidation of around 1% of GDP. As a result of this, we are expecting the debt levels even 2021 to remain elevated. Moreover, the current account deficit for another year is going to be higher. Mind you that this report is time-stamped early April 2020. So whatever the data was available at that time was used for projection, and most of the data at that time was up till December 2020. So the two things that happened after that are very important. One is the revision in the international price of oil. The JEP, June 2021 is now projecting US Brent per barrel dollar price at around 62. While this in the previous projection was around, I think, around 44 US dollars per barrel. So there's a significant hike that is anticipated in the oil price in 2021, which is expected to be the same for 2022. Moreover, what we are seeing is that the tourism is not showing sign of recovery. And this is clear from the global numbers, and this is also clear from the numbers that we are seeing from Jordan. And here too, the vaccination is going to play a very important part. For example, 4 months data into 2021, Jordan is putting the tourism receipts around 230 million, which is 1/3 of the level that was reached even in 2020. So the numbers are even down. But keeping in mind that the first quarter was much better for Jordan because the people were still traveling in the first quarter of 2020, but still we are not anticipating global recovery of tourism anytime in 2021 to the levels of 2019 or either in 2021. So this is going to be a little bit of a wait for all the countries. Moving forward, one slide that is very important, and I wanted to draw attention on this one, and this is also a very interesting box in the Jordan Economic Monitor, and I do encourage you to take a look at that. If you look at the left-hand side figure, what is clear that Jordan growth has been persistently declining for the last 2 decades. And if we take an average between 2004-09, it was the highest growth period where the growth averaged around 7.5%. If we take a look at the average growth during the decade of 2010, including 2020, the average growth has tapered down to 2%, only 2%. Of course, the decade of 2010 is quite different given the fact that it's not just the domestic issues, but the economy was also hit by multiple external shock. But just keeping even that in mind, what the growth accounting results are showing that the total factor productivity for Jordan in the decade of 2010 has turned significantly negative. And the growth that we are seeing in the decade of 2010 seems to be driven by labor accumulation. And this is significantly important that Jordan is now at a point where both the potential GDP has been declining and has plateaued, and also the average growth has been persistently coming down, and there's a need to turn the wheel of the productivity around. And this is one of the most important things that we are seeing in terms of growth revival. In terms of the last slide, so where we go from here, I think what is super important is the building back better for Jordan. In the immediate run, it's completely clear that the health impacts still take precedent in most of the countries, including Jordan, where the vaccination numbers are quite modest and need to be raised. And here, of course, this is not the issue of just the demand side. It's also a supply chain issue for most of the world, where the supply of the vaccine changes week to week and is quite erratic, and not much can be said or done about this. But the need to make sure that most of your population get vaccinated so the economy can open is still the most fundamental question that remains in front of us. The other thing that I talked about is that persistent and declining productivity even prior to the COVID-19 shock. And here, of course, if I just focus on the domestic policies, their super important policies are domestic business regulation, domestic competitiveness, policies to improve business climate, policies that help boost innovation, as well as help the firms use digital technology to enhance productivities. All of this, and you're seeing that I'm putting a lot of emphasis on domestic policies, because of the external side it's still not clear whether the next 6 months or the next 1 year where it would go in terms of the COVID-19 crisis, or whether the growth spur that we are seeing in the world is going to remain permanent or not. So I think that is something, that's why the domestic side of the policies at this juncture is super important. The other important factor is that the labor market indicators are showing significant deterioration, and something needs to change there. Here, we talked about the overall unemployment, but if we look at youth male, 1 out of 2 is unemployed. If you look at youth female, 3 out of 4 are unemployed, and the labor force participation for female in the labor force remains one of the lowest in the world. I think there's a need to turn this around very quickly so that Jordan can basically utilize one of the existing assets that it has in order to turn the wheels of growth further and enhance the productivity that I talked about, that is also declining significantly even prior to the COVID-19 shock. So I am going to stop here. Thank you for your time, and looking forward to our interesting discussion as well as question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadia. This was a very rich helping and summary of the report, and it's indeed very revealing. So basically, there are many themes, and as you've basically summarized in the last slide, the labor market outcomes were suffering well before COVID-19, and even what modest growth we had not managed to reduce unemployment in Jordan. you've remarked that we've actually contracted in our economy in 2020 and the beginning of 2021 at a slower pace than the global markets. Basically, we've declined at about 1%, 1.6%. Our GDP has contracted, while the global average was about 3.3%. But then again, you've mentioned that we're expecting a growth of 1.4% in 2021, while the global average, as was in one of the slides, expected at about 4%. In addition to this, there is the theme of unemployment and the rising poverty and inequality, the current account deficit, and you've touched basically on the forecast for increasing oil prices with the inevitable impact of those on our overall economy and debt. And putting things together, we need to look and see how do we move forward from here and regain momentum and regain growth. Before I start the discussion with the panelists, I would like to invite all our audiences who may have questions, whether they are attending through Zoom or through Facebook, to post their questions on the Q&A as a comment on the Facebook live streaming or on the Q&A box here on Zoom. So I would like to start with you, Dr. Nidal. You're the senior economist at the Central Bank of Jordan, basically. And no doubt you have all this data at your hand and at your control. We've experienced relatively mild contraction in our GDP, and the report from the World Bank says this is because of the very proactive approach that the government and the central bank followed, coupled with the kind of offsetting that happened between oil prices and the reduction in tourism in Jordan. Do you agree with this representation? Do you agree with this finding in the report? And do you have any comments to add to it?
Thank you, Rami, and thanks for Abdulhamid Showman for hosting this event. And also I would like to thank the World Bank team for the extraordinary effort being put into this report. Actually, yes, I read the report carefully, and the part which talked about growth and the type of policies being implemented to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. And actually, in general, we are in line with what was mentioned in the report. Yes, the pandemic hit the economy badly in terms and mainly through the external sector. And I think the report revealed that very, very clearly. We see the travel receipts dropped by 76%, workers' remittances dropped by like 9%, and of course the impact of on the economic sectors related to the travel receipts, transportation, trade, restaurants, and hotels, and other sectors, they were actually badly hit. Now, I think maybe in the first stages of the pandemic, the projections were projecting the economy to go down by something around 5%. And I think that, yes, there were like a lot of mitigating factors were added to the economy, starting with actually travel receipts. Yes, that's one of the key channels through which the pandemic impacted the economy. But we have to keep in mind that usually we spend like 1/4 of the travel receipts abroad. So at the same time, so that was one of the issues which mitigated the impact of on the current account in 2020. Also, we have the the improving terms of trade. That was one of the mitigating factors on the economy, and the lower energy bill during 2020. But at the same time, we see that 38 drop in the energy bill. That was something actually triggered by price and the quantity effects. That was very, very positive to the economy. On the monetary side, if we look, and I think I will go back to this to talk about the central bank interventions and the government interventions and the social security as well, which amounting to something above 11.7% of GDP, including the 8.7% of GDP interventions, which were like implemented by the central bank. Credit to the private sector because of these interventions, it grew by 6.3, compared with something around 4.5, 4.3. That actually, what is interesting in that increase, it is mostly went to the private sector, and it was broad-based. So most of the economic sectors, they benefited from the new credit and the functioning of the credit market. Also, we have to remember that in the first quarter of the year, the central bank very early implemented like accommodative monetary policy and lowered the cost of funding and borrowing in the economy by lowering the interest rates by 1.5% in March. And all the banks, mostly actually all banks, they responded well to the central bank measure. And this lower interest rate regime actually supporting the functioning of the credit market. I can add also the higher external demand, because in the beginning of the pandemic, we were expecting like domestic export because of price and the quantity and channels to go down by 6 to 7%. What happened? And at the end of the year, we found that domestic exports grew by 1% positive. And that was way above our expectations. And all the expectations came from international institutions. Also, workers' remittances proved to be like less sensitive to the volatility and to the negative environment during 2020. We were like mostly expecting remittances to go down by 15 to 20%. What happened? It went down only by 9.1%, and that was actually one of the positive factors. I have to add, I don't want to go into too much details in this. Yes, also, if we go back to the interventions, because the timing of the interventions were very, very important. I will talk just about the central bank. In the beginning, the interventions were targeted, timely, and efficient interventions. If we talk about what about the postponement of the installments, it is amounting to 2.4 billion JDs. And this is like new money being actually directed to the consumption, to investment, and that was one of the mitigating factors in the economy, of which actually about 800. So if I have to wrap up, all these measures actually helped just to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and to see that, yes, the contraction 1.6 was much actually expected by the central bank. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nida. So basically a multitude of effects, one that has offset the other, including the early and proactive intervention from the central bank. Of course, it remains to be seen, and we will come to that at a later point in this panel discussion, how much breadth have we got to continue to support and to regain momentum moving forward. But before we do that, I want to move to Dr. Zafiris. Dr. Zafiris, you're an expert in social policy and development strategy, and it's evident that we have a real problem with unemployment here in Jordan. I mean, the rates have gone up from about 19% in 2019 to about 24.7. I think the presentation by Dr. Sadia mentioned 22.7, but there were other parts in the report that referred to 24.7, with unemployment among the younger sector, the segments of the workforce, standing at about 50%, notwithstanding discrepancies between male and female and the miserable labor force participation by female in Jordan. So basically, we have a huge problem to solve. The central bank and the government intervened at an early point, but many people would argue in the street that coupled with the counter COVID-19 restrictions that were imposed that could have been more lenient, unemployment has risen significantly and still likely to rise. What's your take on the employment prospects and what needs to happen here?
Thank you, Rami, and let me warn you, I don't know whether you saw me coming and going during the presentation. So the line is very bad. I've been knocked out many times and I'm reconnecting. And I missed a lot of the presentation by Dr. Sadia, but I managed to see the slides, but more importantly, I have read the report. which is a very good report. It's factual, it is up to date, and it has very nice, rigorous analysis. So thanks to the World Bank for providing this document for Jordan, and also to Showman Foundation for the invitation. I'm really honored to be with you. Yes, you asked the issue on the unemployment. It has been a perennial, a constant problem of Jordan, the very high rate of unemployment. Even during the early 2000s, from 2003 to 2010, while the economy was booming, historically the highest economic growth rate we had in Jordan, unemployment was between 12 and 14%. It was a constant. So in the 2010s, when things have started going down, it went to 17, 18%, and now got to 24% or 24.5 or whatever. So Jordan has a big problem of unemployment, and the slides, for those who did not read the report, presented a very clear picture why this is the case. We have a very anemic private sector, and over time, especially in 2010 and more recently, there has been a switch from high productivity sectors to low productivity sectors. So the economy does not generate jobs to start with, and those that it creates are pushing down productivity, and the diagrams on total factor of productivity were very disturbing. Now, I don't want to be negative, because we have to give credit to Jordan on how it managed this crisis, which is unique. I mean, we all know, I like the title of the report, Uncertain and Long Trail Ahead. It's not for Jordan, it's for the world. We don't know what this crisis, what's next in this crisis. In 1973, we had the oil crisis, that was an energy crisis. In 2000, we had the technological crisis, it was the IT sector. We had the financial crisis, which was a financial crisis. This is a crisis of the whole economy, in every economy, and the whole world and all the people. It's a crisis of livelihoods, of the economy and lives. So indeed, we are, whoever can tell the future he thinks he can tell the future. I think he will be surprised by what may come later. Now, coming from Jordan, where is employment creation? I calculated quickly from the Jordan Strategy Forum how many jobs have been created throughout 2010 to 18. And 240,000 jobs were created in the private sector and 130,000 jobs in the public sector. So the labor absorption has been made in the public sector. The private sector would like to hire more and more productive, but there is no investment, and there are a number of things that are holding it back. And investment, I think, was mentioned many times in the report. So in the outlook, that the momentum of the economy is going for the next 2 years, the negative momentum. The rebound is going to be 1.4%, 1.5%, and the decrease this year was 1.8%. In the rest of the world, the decrease was 3.3, and the rebound will be 4.4. So Jordan, when you drop, usually you bounce back as a spring. Jordan does not have this dynamism. The debt is going to be increasing. And the private sector, despite the support it got, is heavily indebted. And we don't know where the drivers will be there. An important thing is what is foreign direct investment, and I'm finishing with that, and public investment. Again, the report says that both of them have been low and declining over time. So unless you have new investment, and the public investment has a critical role because it can crowd in a lot of FDI. For example, I mean, Jordan, can spend more publicly and crowd in private investment in the renewable projects. Water, we mentioned 10% of people don't have water, the poorer one. There are roads, thoughts about airports and trains, but public investment has been low and declining. And with the debt overhang, which is increasing and will be increasing until 2023, I mean, the situation is requires a little bit of doing things differently than what they have done in the past. And the final question from my own country and the Euro crisis we had there, when the crisis happened, there was a lot of resentment and a lot of resistance, and rightly so. However, a crisis creates the need to reconsider what you have been doing rather than moving ahead the way you have been doing before. So we need a fundamental change on private sector development, on investment policy, on fiscal consolidation. And let's not forget that a lot of the buoyancy that Jordan managed to keep was because there was the IMF there and the international money. And the 10% that was spent as a rescue package cannot be repeated. So there are issues of sustainability there that call for a massive rethinking of the development paradigm. Let me stop here, although I didn't focus very much on unemployment because unemployment is a symptom. I was more on the causes.
Understood. Thank you very much, Dr. Safiris. So basically, yes, I mean, you've hit the right tone there, saying that the 10% incentive packages and stimuli that was applied is not sustainable. And at the same time, you've used a very, very relevant term, dynamism of the economy. So while we've actually contracted less, but we're not forecasting to grow better, and that requires a true dynamic approach to attracting investments. I mean, even the report, I think, at some point says that previous investments and previous growth has not resulted in the improved situation of unemployment.
You said it better than I did, actually, yes.
Modesty forbids, but no, thank you. I think with that, we can touch possibly on the efficiencies of independent sectors. And I want to move here to the tourism sector, because that's one that has been affected badly with around a decline of tourism inflows, about 67%. And I want to direct the question jointly to Dr. Adli and to Dr. Nidal. And basically the question is, I mean, tourism has really historically played a role in supporting the Jordanian economy. And this sector has been hit badly, not in Jordan, but globally, worldwide. Yet now we are in a position to recover, I think, or at least mildly start becoming more dynamic. So how do you see the prospects of this sector growing moving forward? I mean, let's take some examples here. Greece has already opened up for tourism. Turkey has not closed. Egypt is opening. Both of them have reaped the benefits of that open policy. So how do you see our prospects moving forward in regards to tourism? Dr. Adli, Dr. Nidal, who would like to start? Dr. Adli, would you like to start? You are on mute, Dr. Adli.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Let me first thank the World Bank and Showman Foundation for inviting me to be with the distinguished panelists. Well, as you mentioned, as it is mentioned clearly in the report, the tourism sector has been hit hardly, actually, during the pandemic, dropped by 76%, which is a huge percent, actually. So, and we know that the tourism sector accounts for about 14% of the GDP in Jordan and employs more than 60,000 people directly and indirectly in the sector. In fact, I mean, since the beginning of the year and after all what has happened during last year, the Jordanian authorities, different authorities, are doing everything and in their power to gradually return the tourism sector to what it was before the corona pandemic. However, as you know, the economic activity in this sector, whether locally or internationally, depends mainly on, I mean, interacting with people, meeting people, social communication, mobility, using various means of transportation on land, air, and sea. This requires, of course, crossing borders and moving between countries, and etc. So we are talking about requirements imposed by health sectors and health authorities to achieve health safety conditions that have nothing to do with the economy. So these requirements and conditions, although similar in general in different countries, they differ from one country to another. Some countries, for example, if we talk about Jordan, some countries classify Jordan as safe, green, and other countries classified it as red. And this, of course, affects the mobility and tourism and travel decisions by tourists. So we are talking about requirements and conditions and circumstances that has nothing to do with the economy. It is not a decision whether to travel or to go to a restaurant or to go to a touristic place. It is a matter of, safety. For example, in Jordan, the Dead Sea and the Wadi Musa area have been declared safe tourist destinations during the past few weeks, after all tourism workers in those areas received 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccines. So this means that this is a factor to encourage local tourism and even international tourists to come to Jordan. But the decision, of course, at the end will be in the hands of the tourists themselves. The impact of declaring, for example, if we are talking about figures, the impact of declaring the Dead Sea a safe zone area has already begun to show some results. For example, the occupancy rate in the area hotel rose to 60% following the announcement. This is very encouraging figure. So we are starting to see the on the other side, talking about international tourists, we are starting to see tourists from Russia, from the Gulf area and other countries coming into Jordan. And we hope that there will be a gradual recovery of this industry and a better summer season soon, hopefully. So this has to be, to do with both, proper measures regarding safety measures, and this has to do with vaccinations. Talking about the whole population in Jordan, it's only 11%. This is a low percentage compared to the region and compared to the average of the world. But hopefully, after taking these measures and after opening announcing some places as safe tourist destinations, we will see a gradual recovery in the tourism sector in Jordan in the coming few weeks and in summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adli. Dr. Nidal, I want to come to you, but I want to just pose a simple question here. If we want to really maximize the return of tourism, we probably need to be creative. Jordan has invested in a lot of field hospitals that could be a safety buffer for people should they come and, God forbid, be infected or become at risk of health hazards. But yet we're still a little bit not very forthcoming in tourism. We're very shy about it. We're just opening a pocket here, a pocket there, and not really making it very clear that we are open to the world. So how do you see this? And please give me your perspective on this.
Thank you, Rami. Actually, first, I totally agree with Dr. Adli about the positive signs in this sector. And actually, yes, just to give you the outlook, what is our view on this sector? First of all, we have to rely more now on the more effective vaccination efforts being made. And yes, maybe one of the problems that we have seen that maybe we got some, we were like a little bit late in reopening the sectors, but I think that was justified by the health concerns and the low momentum of the vaccination process. But now, with the 21% of the population actually took the first dose of the vaccination, and something half of that for the 2 doses, I think maybe this is a little bit lower than what we see in the Gulf area, but it is very good in terms of the other neighboring areas in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Tunisia. So I think we see that it gaining like a momentum, and I think in the second half of the year, with what was declared by the government, all the scenarios and all the projections project that in the second half of the year, we will have a very apparent recovery in the sector. In the central bank, and I think this is the way of thinking, and the developments in the first 4 months of the year support what we think about it, what our projections about that. We were like a little bit optimistic than the World Bank and what was mentioned in the report. We are projecting like up to 60% recovery in the travel receipts. Now I can see what is the, yes, it is slow, actually gradual recovery, as Dr. Adel mentioned. During the first 4 months, we recovered like 5 to 6% of the pre-pandemic level. We ended the last quarter of 2020 with 86% on average drop actually, and so we only have 14% compare of the travel receipts realized in 2019. Now, with this 60% actually, now in the average for the first four months, we have like up to 20% of the pre-pandemic level. So we have like 5 to 6 points recovery in that sector for the end of the year. So this goes in line with our projections for the end of the year. So depending on the vaccination and the reopening of the economic sectors, and we have some seasonality because 36 to 46, and now after the pandemic, 56 or 50% contribution for travel receipts coming from Jordanian who are working abroad. So, and what is the early signals of that? We see that more contribution and more returning of this kind of travel. So this is why we still project 60% for the end of the year, and for the coming year for 2022, about 120 to 140. So at the end of 2022, all the projections, and this is supported by even the international institutions' projections, that we will go back to the pre-pandemic level.
Excellent. I mean, that's very encouraging news, and let's just hope that this happens. And I want to benefit from Dr. Zafiris being with us here and the link not cutting. So Dr. Zafiris, I want to move to you. Are you with us, Dr. Zafiris? The picture is stagnant, so I'm just validating if Dr. Zafiris is with us. It appears not, so he probably will reconnect, and I will actually come back to his question in a little bit later. But that being said, I want to skip the question I intended to ask him. Hello? Okay, so I will skip the question to Dr. Zafiris. I intended to ask him about enhancing productivity for future growth prospects, which ties in with the dynamism for the tourism sector. And I will go back to you, Dr. Nidal. Okay, so we're expecting oil prices to go up with an indicatory price of $62 a barrel for the Brent barrel, as Dr. Saadiya mentioned. And what that means is that, you know, our growth financing needs are expected to remain high over the medium term, even because, you know, that will not be offset by the tourism inflows over the coming year. So how is this to be made sustainable? I mean, in the context of our economy, where there's already elevated debt burden, the tax, I mean, I'm not sure about the tax revenues right now. Have they gone down? They're likely to have gone down. But how are we going to have sustainability in that department, Dr. Nidal?
So just to make sure that I get your question right about the sustainability of financing of for what, the general, for the budget, or for the current account? For the budget.
The budget.
I think, you know, I would prefer just this question to be directed to the Minister of Finance. But I would say that, yes, actually, there is a very close coordination between the Minister of Finance and the central bank. And I think we have a very a good idea about the financing needs of the budget. And you know that we have a very good relation with the international institutions. Today, we have a new financing actually being signed with approved by the World Bank. And we have actually the concessional financing within the IMF program, and it is already there. And actually the report will explain the easiness and the access to the international market by Jordan. So you remember that in June of 2020, actually Jordan succeeded just to issue $1.75 billion, and with a very competitive actually interest rate yield. So I think Jordan, first domestically, we have very active money market, and we have the liquidity is there at the banking sector, and it is being closely monitored by the central bank. And this is for the domestic sources of financing. And in terms of the external financing, yes, we have very concessional. Most of the financing for the budget and for the current account, actually it is in the type of concessional and long-term financing. And we have actually access to the international markets at very competitive rates. But if you actually want more details about it, I would prefer you just to direct this question to our colleagues in the Ministry of Finance.
Indeed, they probably would be the more natural recipient for this question. But since they're not here, we thought that you would be the closest to that. But thank you very much for a very clear answer that you have just given. Dr. Zafiris appears to have just reconnected. So I would like to go back to a question I intended for him. So let's just bear while the audio connects. Dr. Zafiris, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Sorry, guys, the Greek islands talking about tourism. Perhaps we have too many tourists and they are draining the internet. Yeah.
Well, don't worry, Dr. Zafiris. I want to actually benefit from you being here to ask about a couple of questions and tie them together. One is about the need. I mean, basically, COVID-19 has really had an acute impact and adverse effect on the private sector. And, in addition to that adverse impact, we also are already suffering from a productivity issue, okay? I want to hear your perspective. I mean, do you agree on how severe the impact on the private sector has been? And what can we do to mitigate that, and especially around the productivity side of those businesses and the economy at large?
Yes, I think what the report shows and the surveys indeed confirm that there has been a very severe impact. And one issue here is that if you get a shock and already you have a problem, can you hear me? Because I hear some noises.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, yeah. Like if you're healthy and you have a medical condition, you can overcome it. If you already have ailments and you get a hit, then good luck somehow. And we know most of the deaths from COVID were associated with pre-existing conditions and among the older people. So yes, the impact has been severe. Now, the issue here is what kind of driver, looking forward, what kind of drivers we have to make the private sector dynamic. I think one statistic is somehow the liquidity that we have in Jordan, in the banks, is more than the demand.
I fear we have lost Dr. Zafiris again. Dr. Zafiris, yes, you are back. Dr. Zafiris. Dr. Zafiris?
Yeah, I mean, there is a liquidity there. Yes, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
There is a lot of liquidity. I'm very happy to see that the Bank of Jordan has reserves for 8-9 months, which is, I mean, a dream somehow. But this is a good thing to have. But at the same time, we have that imports are much higher than exports. So we have to identify why this is the case. And the exports are mainly from the private sector. I mean, they're not from the government. So there should be, we should make the private sector dynamic. I mean, look, I'll put it this way somehow. I first came to Jordan in '91 when you had a similar problem with the so-called returnees, not refugees. These were the returnees from Kuwait. And the IMF and the World Bank did a program. And they said a number of things that they were followed in the 1990s, and unemployment and the economy rebounded by the late 1990s. Now there is this 5-year reform matrix, which is the basis for continuing lending and supporting the Jordanian economy. So this year it's the midterm review. I would say it's a good time to see how far this reform matrix has been implemented. What are the results? Do we need to adjust some things? Do we need to intensify others? But I would say 90% of what needs to be done is there. Now, the situation is, do we have time to do it? And can we breathe? Because one fundamental statistic that Jordan is facing is it averted the crisis for now. But the dollar-denominated debt for the next 10 years has an interest rate of 5-6%. And the economy in the last 10 years has been growing by 2%. Next year will be 1.5%, then another 2%. Now, if the interest you have to pay on the debt is higher than your growth rate, every year you lose a lot. So effectively, you are kicking the can down the road, as they say in English. So this is a fundamental issue that will require somehow a restructuring of the debt again. But of course, this is a temporary solution because you pass the repayments to the young generation, and the youth are already destituted. They don't have jobs, and you pass the debt to be paid by the future generation, which does not have a job, and they are paid low wages because there is low productivity, because the private sector is not dynamic. And the public sector cannot continue kind of expanding and being the employer of the last resort, as they say. So I will leave it here, and perhaps if there are any questions, we can expand on these things.
We're approaching near the end of this session.
And sorry for
Thank you for making the effort to remain here, Zafiris. We really appreciate this despite the bad connection. I'm going to ask a final question, and I will start by Dr. Adli answering it, and then I will open it for any follow-ups, and then I would like to take a few questions that have been posed from the audiences. Dr. Adli, I mean, basically the report says we're at a critical juncture. We are at a critical juncture, نقطة حرجة basically, and in order to minimize the permanent scarring to the economy, we need to act in a dynamic way. If you were in the decision-making seat today, what would be the top 3 priorities that you will make the government follow immediately, and why?
Well, thank you very much. Actually, this is a very easy question because wherever you look in Jordan, you can find a priority. So this makes life easy for the government and for even the private sector and for the decision makers. But let me be very precise in answering this question. I mean, regarding the health situation, I think we need to quick the vaccination process because it is still, I mean, very low compared to the average of the region and the world average. So vaccination process has to be quick, especially among the labor force in different sectors. As for the economic aspect, I believe that the first priority is to maintain financial stability, actually. And the second priority is support economic growth. We need to revitalize the economy and to have higher rates of economic growth, at least higher than the population growth rate. And the third priority is to create jobs and enhance social protection, because too many people have lost their jobs during the pandemic, and we need to have a social safety net for those people who lost their jobs. For the financial stability, we know that it is an essential requirement, not only for price stability as the policy goal of the central bank, but also for the healthy development of the economy as a whole. This is because financial instability initials heavy cost for the economy. If the volatility of price variable is in the financial markets increase, financial institutions or corporations may go bankrupt. In addition, economic development can be limited at such a time, since economic agents find it difficult to make rational decisions and the efficiency of resource allocation is reduced. So we need to make sure that financial stability is, and this is a job that has been done very properly by the central bank. At the same time, with high public debt reaching 107% of the GDP last year, and with an exchange rate peg, ensuring macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability have become more and more important. So we should talk about, elaborate more on debt sustainability as well. In addition, adjustment reforms to boost growth and employment, including by reducing obstacles to formal employment, particularly for youth and women, enhancing the business environment and improving governance and transparency. All these are very essential requirements to boost economic growth. Reforms are also critical for the energy sector. The industrial sector, is suffering a lot from the high prices of energy, where pressures have increased in the aftermath of the pandemic. So, as I said, many people have lost their jobs since the start of the pandemic, and more efforts has to be done to be focused on creating jobs and protecting households from poverty and from losing the jobs. These are the main top priorities that I can see for the coming months of this year.
Thank you, Dr. Adli. Dr. Nidal, I will come to you, but I want to blend this question with a question from one of our audiences, who is Mr. Dirar Shboul. He asks, do you see the government as being serious in creating an attractive and a lucrative investment atmosphere and environment in Jordan, and in providing the right infrastructure for it? So is the government serious, and what would be the top priorities from your perspective, Dr. Nidal?
Yes, thank you, Rami. But I want just let me to highlight two very quick points. First, about debt sustainability. And I think Dr. Sabir and Dr. Adli talked about it. First of all, this is very typical exercise, being that it's being done by the government, by the Ministry of Finance, by the IMF, and actually the public debt proved to be sustainable. And we have not to ignore that in 2 days from now, we will have the second review actually approval by the board of directors at the IMF. And this proves that the government has a very clear plan about the fiscal consolidation and about and very optimistic actually plan for the future. And the second point, Dr. Adli talked about the financial sector. Yes, for the 2020, actually all the financial soundness indicators, whether we are talking about the capital adequacy ratio, liquidity, about the non-performing loans, 5.5 compared with 5. So all were like actually very comfortable and higher than what is being recommended by the international institutions. And when we are talking about the priorities by the government, let's not to actually forget that we already actually the big effort have been actually made during the pandemic. We talked about the stimulus package by the government, 2.7% of GDP, by the central bank. That was one of the very quick fixes to the economy and just to preserve jobs and to stabilize the economy. Looking forward, again, everything is there. And we have the 5-year reform matrix, and which was released in the London initiative, actually. And we have the IMF program. The priorities, it is very structural reforms, impediments to the economic growth. I think Dr. Adli talked about some measures. I think labor market is one of the priorities. We have 14% participation of women, female in the working age population. This is very low. And I think the government has very good plans about how to incentivize this, whether by providing more services, daycare services, safe transportation, and so on. We have the business climate. I think, yes, they're doing business, and the cost of running business and starting up the business, this is one of the priorities. And the third one is, which is actually comes behind the mandatory of the mandate of the central bank, financial inclusion. I think this is very important. We have the 2017 financial inclusion strategy. It is a success, actually. We started with a financial inclusion ratio lower than 24%. We ended up 2020 with 50%, with lower gender gap. And I think now we already published the report and the executive plan for 2021. Now we have a new, actually, working on the new financial strategy plan, strategy plan for the medium term. And I think it will incorporate more tools like women empowerment. This is very important, and green finance, how to green the financial sector, and just to take more about the environment, the social responsibility. I think the plan is very apparent for the government and it is well discussed with the World Bank, our partner, and the IMF. And I think everyone and the government is more than serious to tackle this and to just promote more inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nidal. Dr. Zafiris, also benefiting from you being with us still, we have a question from Mr. Jenkins Jihan. I mean, basically, he's saying that Jordan is a small economy, and one of the key obstacles is the recovery from the current crisis would be the lack of dynamism. And what he is saying is basically that we need more accommodative and expansionary fiscal policies that target micro and small business enterprises, and that this would be the way forward. And do you agree that if such policies were instated and targeted small enterprises, micro enterprises, export-oriented and knowledge-based startups, would that actually help to make the economy more dynamic and provide more room for growth moving forward?
Yes, thanks for the question. Look, it will help. It will help. And the small enterprises and micro enterprises are also not only contributing to the real economy, but also to reduction in poverty. It's flexible within household production. Women can work easier, and there are many advantages. However, like we see now, that if you have a systemic crisis, everything falls. These sectoral improvements will not make the total to be greater than the sum of the parts. And when we come, for example, to the objective of employment, yes, it can be an objective, but the policy there is on the systemic reforms that one can have. Jordan is a small open economy. What it means is that in a globalizing world, it doesn't matter how much progress we do. And Dr. Nidal listed a lot of things which I didn't mention, but they are also in the report. In a globalized economy, it doesn't matter how fast you move. It matters how fast you move relative to the others. If the world is moving very fast and you are moving half that rate in a smaller open economy, you are losing. I think from the report, from the monitor, I counted that in the last 40 years, about 17 or 18 years have seen negative per capita growth. So the economy is out of tune with the people and the labor market. So this is something that needs to be addressed. And I want to say that the reform program is already a basis. One cannot invent from zero, but it has to be adjusted. So I will say that this is a big crisis, and the medium term is very tough because, as I said, the dynamics are for the debt to increase, for the deficit to increase, for the trade balance to deteriorate for the next 2 years, at least when we have projections till 2023. But this gives a good opportunity to rethink again the development model. And the development model cannot continue with persistent deficit that increases the debt. It cannot continue with imports being more than the exports. And let's put it this way, something that is a sacred cow, I mean, in many economies, that in the last 40 years, I mean, since 1990, the Jordanian dinar has been pegged to the dollar. A lot has changed then. It should have appreciated or depreciated. I mean, in all small open economies, your safety valve is the exchange rate. And once you keep it there, like the Lebanese did, I mean, for more than 20 years, when it comes, instead of having a slight depreciation over time or an increase when you are doing well, effectively, you put a straitjacket to the economy and you force the economy to a situation that it cannot adjust to all these imbalances, the structural problems that Jordan has. So, of course, it has many advantages to have a pegged exchange rate, because the minute you mention capital controls or depreciation, I mean, the banks will become empty. So it needs to be an approach that will take all the real sector, the financial sector, the public sector, but the emphasis should be on the private sector, because the jobs will come from the private sector, either as employees or in tourism or in small enterprises.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Safiris.
Rami, please, I need to comment on what Dr. Safiris mentioned.
Please do.
Yes, please. Actually, I respect what he mentioned, but I totally agree with what he talked about, the exchange rate policy. Let's just remember this policy, which was adopted in 1995. If we look at even what was the report mentioning about the positive productivity, the competitiveness of the external sector, and the gains we have actually made during that period, this proves that the exchange rate was of the of the very important tools just to stabilize the economy. Now, just to see and just to evaluate and to assess the exchange rate policy, this needs a lot of tools, and we do it on systemic action on frequent basis. We do it with the domestically, and this is being even exercised and assessed by the International Monetary Fund in each staff report they made. All the studies show that the exchange rate is about it's around its long-term fundamentals, around its long-term equilibrium. So, and this says that if we take the domestic variables, investment or consumption, and take the external sector, the current account, which is one of the basic and key variables used to assess the appropriate, the convenience of the exchange rate. What is the most recent one, evaluation, that the exchange rate is very consistent with the long-term fundamentals. And the second last point about it, if we look at the fruits and the payoff of this very stable exchange rate, so we have to, the central bank always, even during the pandemic and now, confirms that this exchange rate, and this is mentioned even in all in IMF staff reports, that the exchange rate policy, the big exchange rate policy, serves the Jordan economy well. And if we look at all the performance of the macroeconomic indicators, yes, you see some volatility, sometimes appreciation, depreciation. What we need to look at the exchange rate, we need to look at it in the long-term context. So I think on the opposite of what was mentioned by Dr. Savir, it is one of the actually incentives and the triggers to the foreign direct investment. Yes, we have actually slowing down in foreign direct investment in the last couple of years. But let's remember, before 2014 and 2015, so the average was above $2 billion. And this proves that one of the triggers for this attractiveness of the investment climate is there's the limited deal of uncertainty in the economy and the full mobility of and convertibility of the Jordan dinar and the full credibility of the exchange rate policy being adopted and by the central bank and supported by the international institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Nidal. I think we have room for one final question, which I will address to Dr. Adli, and then we will take a closing note from Dr. Sadia. So before that, Dr. Adli, we have a question from Mr. Zaidoun Abu Hassan, who says that the economy has been deteriorating for the past 10 years, and COVID only basically shed more light on this deterioration. And he says major reforms are needed, and one major reform is to reverse some monetary laws, especially Law 202 for the year 2002, which liberalized the lending process to the max. I'm not aware of the law myself, so I don't know if you are, since you were the head of the Banking Association for a good 14 years. So, Dr. Adli.
Well, I don't exactly know what is the exact law that he's referring to, actually. But I suppose that he means that the central bank does not interfere in the credit policy of the banks. I mean, they leave it to the bank to lend to any sector or and to meet the demand of the economy. So if I understand this properly. And this is a part of the liberalization process that has been done in Jordan in the beginning of the 90s. So the central bank does not interfere in the lending process or policies of the banks themselves. But on this point, if I am on the right track, answering the right question, I might, add that we need to, consider, the lending policies of the banking sector, especially when we talk about the SDGs, the sustainability of the economy and the environment and the green financing, etc. And I suppose that the central bank is very much aware of these developments, and they are considering to issue certain regulations regarding green financing. And I'm with these policies to give some directions to the banks to be very much clever, and they are clever in lending, in their lending policies. So this to distinguish between lending to a person who wants a loan to buy a car, or for a person who wants to establish a project taking the environment and the economy into consideration. So we need to
draw that distinction,
very precise in these lending policies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adli. I think we are caught in time, so I invite Dr. Sadia. Dr. Sadia, any final word on the uncertain and long trail ahead?
Well, thank you so much. It has been a very interesting discussion, and at least I have learned a lot from this like the report title says, I think there's still time to go where we have significant downside risk in terms of how much the global economy is going to recover in the 2021 and 2022. One thing is clear, and I think we need to keep a close tab on that most of the world by 2020 is not going to recover from the economic growth shock that they received prior to going into COVID-19 crisis, even until 2022. And this is true for almost 75% of the emerging markets. And I think that should give some perspective in terms of the challenge that we see in front of us at the moment. The second thing, as we talked about tourism, given it's a very critical sector for Jordan, is that the global sign in terms of the tourism recovery are also showing slow sign of recovery. It is showing sign, but some of the estimates are putting the numbers in 2023 to reach the COVID-19 shock year, which was the 2019. So I think we need to be cognizant of those things in order to deal with those realities as well. And very quickly, I think at this juncture, the macroeconomic stability is, as Dr. Zafaris has talked about, Dr. Nadal has talked about, and Dr. Adli has talked about, needs to be in the forefront. The issue of fiscal space is super important at this juncture, and also need to increase the efficiency of spending, because what you have as a pie, you can spend better. And I think this is where we are, where we need to be conscious of the fact that if you have this spot, then at least try to enhance the efficiency of spending and do a little bit of more balancing act between the recurrent spending and the capital spending, given the multiplier impact coming from the capital spending. I think that's something that needs to be weighed in carefully. And last, just to close, I think, like I said, we need to prioritize, right? Because you cannot do 100 things at a time when you have a shock. You need to do 3 to 4 and do them well and do them in deep. So basically the dynamism that we want to see from some sector, at least we see them rather than we do 50 things, but none of them pay dividends. So I think that's one policy lens where we need to look at. And the second one is that the inclusive policy, we talked about very briefly about the fact that the impact on the household is long-term, particularly on the poor and vulnerable, in terms of losing their human capital as a result of education, dividends being very different during the COVID shock year, the access to health being very different, and that will take a time to build back better. And during that time, the government policies need to make sure that those people remain inclusive part of the growth to create a more cohesive growth model for the country. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Dr. Sadia, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of this very interesting session. On behalf of the World Bank Group in Jordan and the Abdulhamid Foundation, Abdulhamid Shooman Foundation, I would like to thank Dr. Sadia, Dr. Nidal, and Dr. Adli, and Dr. Zafiris for giving us the time to be part of the launch of this Jordan Economic Monitor report for the spring of 2021. And I would like to invite the audiences to download the report, which should be online maybe anytime in the coming day or so, to actually examine it. Thank you all very much, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rami and Sadia.
Thank you, Rami.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye.